Thank you very much. This dissertation titled Community Engagement in Site of Conscience, a managerial strategy to achieve sustainability, proposed an understanding of site of conscience as complex systems, arguing that community engagement is a key factor for these sites to be socially sustainable. As an introduction, over the last decades, the identification of site of conscience as part of our cultural heritage has gained special significance as they serve as witnesses of the violence carried out during the dictatorships, wars, and massacres that have swept different nations. In Chile, for instance, 30 years have passed since the return of democracy after Pinochet's regime. And within this time frame, the Chilean government has recognized some of the places used for torture and killing during the dictatorship as national monuments. As part of our cultural heritage, sites of conscience play an active role in their societies. Furthermore, heritage and communities are connected by the significance heritage has to its people and by the community's role in its preservation and understanding. Thus, the recognition of community engagement as an essential aspect in valuing and maintaining sites of conscience will contribute to the protection and preservation of these sites for future generations. Therefore, when studying the way in which communities relate to sites of conscience, multiple questions arise, especially about how to manage these places. These are significant questions if we consider that not all the places where human rights were violated are considered sites of conscience, but only those that are appropriated and used by a community. And in other words, the sustainability of a site of conscience depends mainly on how successful it is in engaging with its communities. For this reason, the aim of this dissertation was to explore the relationship between management and community engagement at this type of sites. To do so, I studied the case of Villa Grimaldi in Santiago, Chile, one of the most important and well-known sites of conscience in the country and the Southern Cone. But what do we mean by a site of conscience, and what is the difference between a site of conscience and, for example, a site of memory? We will understand the term site of memory as those places where atrocities happened and where the associative value related to remembrance and commemoration are important elements. Furthermore, from the literature review, I defined that the site of memory is sustained by three pillars: a specific memory, one or more communities, and the functions these sites fulfill. Since the term site of memory referred to a broad range of places, in the 90s, the concept of site of conscience was coined to define those sites of memory that not only recall significant events, but also interpreted the history through the site, engaging the public to discuss pressing social issues. In other words, if the main function of a site of memory is the commemoration, in a site of conscience, this would be the education. Since site of conscience are also site of memory, they are sustained by the same three pillars aforementioned. And for the communities of a site of conscience, we can classify them in a core community and broader communities. A core community does not simply participate in the process, but it's actively empowered. And in this regard, many authors have defined a site of conscience core community as a memory community, which is usually constituted by survivors and victims' families who appraise these places and demand the recognition and protection, aiming to transmit their particular memory. On the other hand, within the broader community, we have the state, the site managers, the local community, people who did not experience the trauma, that is the new generations. And in addition, a more difficult community for the site to engage with are those who deny or justify the atrocities of the past. Communities interact with the site of conscience through the functions these sites fulfill. In this regard, four main functions of site of conscience were identified, namely memorial, evidential, educational, and political. From the literature review, I concluded that each community and function at a site of conscience is not an isolated factor. In fact, they relate to each other in complex and multidimensional ways. Site of conscience thus can be studied as complex systems where community engagement is a crucial factor to achieve the sustainability of the whole system, as it will ensure its significance over time and therefore the transmission of its memory. Regarding the methodology, some data gathering methods for this study included desk-based research, interviews, and visitors review. Due to the current COVID-19 situation and the impossibility of visiting the site, accessing visitors' perception was not easy. Therefore, I analyzed visitors' review on online platforms such as Facebook and TripAdvisor. And the analysis of this type of reviews attempted to gather information about the site's audience and to explore how visitors engage with Villa Grimaldi. The most relevant data was extracted from visitors' review and interviews and organized into related subjects. The selected case, as I mentioned, was Villa Grimaldi because it was one of the biggest and most organized places commanded by the military, which had a neuralgic role in the repression that took place in Santiago. Originally, Villa Grimaldi was part of the Hacienda de Peñalolén and corresponded to the administrator house. In 1946, the house was converted in a restaurant called Paraíso Villa Grimaldi due to its similarity with an Italian villa and the luxury of its gardens. After the coup in 1973, Villa Grimaldi was raided and occupied by the military, and between 1974 and 1978, Villa Grimaldi was known as Cuartel Terranova. During this time, the villa was used as a clandestine center of detention, torture, and killing. It is estimated that approximately 4,500 people were imprisoned in this place, of which more than 200 are detenidos desaparecidos. In 1978, Villa Grimaldi was abandoned, leading to a fast process of deterioration. In 1987, the property was sold to a real estate company, which in 1990 started the destruction of the buildings to erase all evidence, as you can see in the picture, unleashing the concern of neighbors and the victims of the site. As a result, in 1993, the state expropriated Villa Grimaldi to convert it to a place of reflection about the traumatic past, stopping any other interventions of the site. Unfortunately, the house and other buildings were demolished, and only the swimming pool and parts of the house entrance steps remained. The park opened to the community in 1997 as a gathering place to remember the victims and to reflect on the violation of human rights committed during the dictatorship. Due to the lack of material vestige at the site, the design of the Park for Peace used several symbolic elements, as you can see in some of the pictures. And later, the reconstruction of certain structures, such as the tower, was also considered. From the data set, I identified 3 factors of engagement based on emotional and cognitive connection with the sites. Those are the perceptions on the site's interpretation, emotional response, and levels of empathy. From the graph, most of the responses were about the interpretation of the site, followed by levels of empathy and emotional responses. Now, I will mention some of the most interesting findings from each topic. Analyzing perceptions on the site's interpretation was used to evaluate if the site's content was achieving its goal of increasing awareness among visitors and promoting valuation of the site. In this regard, visitors referred to 3 aspects of interpretation: content, presentation, and conservation. Content in a site of conscience highly depends on the functions of the site and therefore is probably the most contested aspect of interpretation. Content can be influenced by political and cultural struggles, and visitors are very susceptible to these stimuli. Furthermore, the same place can be perceived differently by different people, and this diversity of perception can be noted in the reviews in this slide. Although most of the visitors appreciated Villa Grimaldi's content, what they mentioned having enjoyed more was the presentation, that is, the way in which the site is displayed to visitors. Visitors refer to Villa Grimaldi as a beautiful park or a peaceful place. In fact, the word beautiful was the second most mentioned after place, as you can see in the word cloud. Other words also mentioned were peace, garden, and tranquility. In this sense, although Villa Grimaldi's narrative connects emotionally with its visitors, the aesthetic of the park hinders intellectual connections with the historical facts. To avoid being considered just a pretty park, the Villa Grimaldi Corporation reconstructed some of the most distinctive buildings to display to some extent the experience of being at the Cuartel Terranova. Some visitors refer to these structures as enablers of memory in a site with not many vestiges to see. In other words, the memorial function of the site for people who did not experience the trauma, although is activated by non-authentic structures, promote and enhances an emotional and intellectual experience at the site, since the reconstructions act as proof of truth, enabling an empathic identification with the site's narrative. Sites of conscience are also emotional places. In this regard, most of the visitors mention having experienced feelings of sadness when they visit Villa Grimaldi. Some refer to their experience as shocking and heartbreaking. Sadness and anger were emotions shared by people from different communities, since all empathize with the pain of those who mourn a beloved person. For instance, this review in the slide was from a relative of a victim in the Villa Grimaldi. Regarding the levels of empathy, empathy plays an essential role in community engagement, since it relies upon the capacity of visitors to identify themselves with the narrative being related. Reviews which showed high levels of empathy tended to reflect on the atrocities at Villa Grimaldi, identifying themselves with the victims' feelings and story. Additionally, some visitors referred to guided tours as triggers of empathy, since they are generally carried out by survivors. Visitors stated that listening to testimonies firsthand enabled stronger connections with Villa Grimaldi's victims. Conversely, a review was considered to be disengaged when it argued that the narrative was biased or politicized, and as well as when it mentioned not feeling represented by the content of the site, such as the review in the slide. Disengagement is an issue recognized by Villa Grimaldi's managers, who mentioned that people who did not directly suffer the repression or who are not relatives of these people perceive these places as spaces that tell the story of others. Additionally, there were also reviews that used different statements to distance themselves from the site's content. Most of the reviews in this category did not mention anything about the narrative, but they referred to Villa Grimaldi as a nice or beautiful park, which, as we have seen, relates to the perceptions on the site's presentation. In this regard, some visitors wrote about Villa Grimaldi as an ordinary park, as we can see, for example, in this slide. Since Villa Grimaldi has several communities that interact with each other and with the site, managing engagement is not an easy task. The role of managers is to minimize contestation by promoting dialogue, cooperation, and participation among the different parties involved, while enhancing visitor experience. However, although Villa Grimaldi's managers are aware of the factors that promote engagement, there are also some managerial aspects that currently challenge this task. Firstly, Villa Grimaldi is organized following a hierarchical structure. The organization is headed by the Villa Grimaldi Corporation, followed by the board, which most of them are survivors and victims' relatives, who are responsible of the decision making. According to managers, one of the drawbacks of this kind of structures is the high influence that the board has in the site's functions and interpretation. In this respect, memorial and political functions continue to be more dominant than those uses that could bring together a broader spectrum of societies, such as education. Strongly related to organizational structure is Villa Grimaldi's strategic plan. According to the current strategic plan, the memorial function of the site stands out above other functions, while education is still relegated to a secondary role. In other words, in its managerial document, Villa Grimaldi appears as a site of memory rather than a site of conscience. And furthermore, the document makes no reference to actions for improving community engagement. Funding is another managerial issue. Villa Grimaldi is currently funded by a mixed system made up of public and private subsidies, which allows the site to bear the running cost of Villa Grimaldi. Nevertheless, this funding is not enough to cover the cost of educational and cultural programs, which depends on competitive funds. This financial uncertainty makes planning and management extremely difficult, especially in years of budget cuts, such as last year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Sites of conscience are dynamic places, which implies that a space that today can be considered a site of conscience can become a space empty of meaning tomorrow, because it stopped making sense. From this perspective, sustainability at a site of conscience lies in its capacity of generating community engagement. In this context, a clear comprehension of visitor experience and its factors for engagement is crucial for developing managerial and interpretational strategies for increasing awareness, involvement, and participation, and hence engagement. Engagement, thus, should not be considered a goal itself, but a process, an ideal way to sustain and organize the relationship between the site and its community. Finally, failing in engaging communities and therefore failing in sustaining the site can have several consequences. The main one, according to managers, is that the message of respect for human rights will not reach new communities. In other words, the main risk of failing in engaging communities is that the narrative of the site, and that is the memory of atrocities committed there, becomes irrelevant. Since a site's narrative is the means to promote empathy, keeping memory of trauma alive is necessary for a more democratic and just society, where repetition of traumatic events is less likely. For this reason, an exhaustive understanding of the issues explored in this dissertation presents opportunities for improving engagement at many different sites of conscience, not only in Chile, but also in the international context. Community engagement at site of conscience should continue to be of interest to managers and academics as a key for this site's sustainability. Thank you.